Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Verifiably Random. We share stories about the incredible work being done across the Algorand ecosystem. My name is Matt Keller. I run the Vertical Impact, and I'm joining Min and Mark now as a third person on this podcast. And we are going to be focusing on impact exclusively throughout this series. And so we'll be talking to folks from the United Nations, from partners in our ecosystem, and from others that we are engaged with who are working to use the Algorand blockchain in a way that we think makes the world a better place. So the first guest we have today on the impact portion of this show is Nigel Pont. Nigel is our strategic advisor for Humanitarian Affairs and also works very closely with HesabPay, who many of you know. Has been a shining star in our ecosystem. So Nigel, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. Good to be here.
All right, good to have you, man. So listen, I know, you've been in this space, the humanitarian space, for a long time. I think, 25, 30 years or something. Why don't you give us a little bit about yourself and your background and where you started and how you got to where you are?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So I've been in the humanitarian sector since 1993, where I was working in refugee camps in Afghanistan. And I've been working, in many different countries around the world, from the Middle East to the Balkans to Central Asia to Southeast Asia, and doing different types of humanitarian work. But during that work, I became increasingly involved in cash programming. So what's happened in the humanitarian sector is that the sector has moved from giving people stuff to trying to give people cash. As long as markets work, giving people cash is better than giving them stuff. And then the way that cash is being handed out has changed dramatically over the last 20 years or so, 25 years. So in the early days, it was, sacks of cash in the back of a pickup truck, drive out to a location, have somebody sign or put a thumbprint on a piece of paper, to nowadays where we're doing some of this on chain. So I think that's sort of the progression. And so me personally, I spent until 2020, I was working directly sort of inside humanitarian organizations. And then 5 years ago, I made the switch to sort of come onto the private sector side, spending a lot of time with HesabPay to build sort of the products and the partnerships on the humanitarian side, particularly in Afghanistan and Syria. And yeah, for the last couple of years, working really, really closely with you at the foundation to build this work globally. And it's been quite a ride so far.
And your whole life has been informed by this kind of work, right? Weren't your parents engaged in medical practices in Pakistan and elsewhere?
Yeah, my parents were surgeons. So they were in Iran for 16 years and Pakistan for 32 years. So I was born in Iran. I grew up in Pakistan. And so I sort of understand this world pretty well, and have some, reasonable insights into sort of where a lot of the friction is. And, I've combined that a little bit sort of I got into crypto personally in about 16 or so. And, started to, as I learned more about it, sort of that humanitarian perspective, along with sort of a gradually deepening understanding of the potential for the technology, really sort of made me see, if we brought some of these things together, it could make a real difference in the lives of some of the world's most vulnerable people.
Yeah, and I want to kind of dive a little bit deeper into that, particularly on the technology side. But I mean, first, I guess 2 weeks ago now, there was I think a really good article in the New York Times, which is kind of a home run for HesabPay. And the title was "An Unlikely Source of Crypto Innovation," and it had a photo of folks in Afghanistan. Talk a little bit about that story, what it means for HesabPay, and I'll come back to ask you a bit more about HesabPay, but talk about that story in the context of our work there together, and what that means.
Yeah. So I mean, that New York Times article, there's probably one of the very few good news, feel good articles coming out of Afghanistan in the last few years. It's mostly doom and gloom, with
Well,
a lot of.
and a good article about crypto as well, right? I mean, there's so much negativity in this space, and so much kind of derision and angst. But you see a story like that, innovation coming out of Afghanistan using blockchain, the Algorand blockchain. That's also kind of a feel good story. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, HesabPay sort of originated from, the parent company of HesabPay and the founder, Sanzar, ran a large payroll, tax, audit, HR firm processing a lot of things, and just payments didn't work well in Afghanistan. Mobile payments had never taken off. And, there was no interoperability. It was really dire despite sort of tens of millions of dollars spent by the international community during that sort of period of sort of the international intervention from 2001 to 2020. And so when Sanzar wanted to really get HesabPay going, one of the key things in his mind was trust. I want to build a system that is incontrovertibly sort of trustworthy and reliable. People may not care about blockchain, but I'm going to put it on blockchain because I want it to be beyond a shadow of a doubt that we know what's happened where everything is. And so we originally built on the Stellar blockchain. And there was, it worked okay for a while, but once we started to hit some scale and volume, we hit a number of technical issues, which to resolve them incurred a lot of additional cost on the company. It's bootstrapped Afghan company, need to keep everything really cheap, and it needs to be incredibly reliable. And that wasn't the experience that we had on that chain. So we started shopping around and said, look, if we really want to scale this, what's the sort of the fundamental preconditions that we need in a blockchain in order to sort of run a micropayment system in this kind of environment with, incredible reliability. And so, there were a few key characteristics that we were sort of filtering for as we scanned the available L1s. And, fast was sort of top of the list. I mean, when you're doing a retail transaction, it needs to happen virtually instantly. It needed to be cheap because people are, making sometimes tiny transactions, and obviously the transaction fee, the gas fee on that can't be a lot, and that fee needs to be predictable. So those were the first two things, and then we needed reliability. And there's sort of I mean, people listening and the technical team the foundation knows better than me, but there's varying reliability across these systems. However, when we encountered Algorand, it's always on. It's just there, and it works, and it's fast, and it's cheap. And it may we looked around, and there were some sort of flashier chains, maybe with bigger profiles, etc. But just for like performance, for the function that we wanted, for real world payments in this kind of environment, nothing really came close. And then I think the final couple of things about that was that, we really wanted something that was environmentally sound. Yeah, it's like we don't want to solve this problem over here, but then potentially contribute or towards that problem over there. And the carbon footprint of Algorand is obviously incredibly low. So I think those technical pieces combined with sort of, I mean, you and me personally are very values aligned and sort of mission aligned, but I think sort of more broadly between the foundation and the HesabPay leadership, clear alignment that these are we're both institutions, both sets of stakeholders really wanted to solve this problem and make a difference. So I think a combination of the technology and the values really came together for us.
And in the payment side, with instant finality as well. If you're not with in the club of instant finality, super cheap transaction fees, sustainability, you don't really have something that's fit for the payments world, and particularly the humanitarian payments world. You can't be waiting to cash out at a merchant, waiting for food, and you're waiting and waiting and waiting. You need something that you can trust. I mean, and if you don't have those things, you can't really enter that game. And so when we met, it seemed like a perfect fit, as you said, that our values aligned. I had done some work in Afghanistan with one laptop per child years and years ago. And also like you fell in love with it, understood the landscape and the need for something different because, I was at the World Food Program for a number of years, and I saw cash handouts on the ground. And it's not pleasant, right? It's not a pretty sight, because what you see are people waiting for 24 hours to get some cash. And it works okay, but there's a lot of there's danger kind of within that. There's corruption kind of inherent in that. And it was interesting, right after a few months after we met, the London School of Economics did a study on 2,500 women, a randomized study, and they followed them using his HesabPay app, and they found when women use this app, they receive money in their wallet, and good things happen as a result. There's less hunger in their families. There's less theft. There's less violence. There's less corruption. And that really got us kind of super engaged with what you guys are doing. And not long after that, you came over and kind of had this dual role. So yeah, I think the technology really is fit for purpose in this case. And as we move into Syria, as the Times article indicated, that is also going to be, I think, a profoundly important tool, particularly for aid organizations trying to get money into the hands of folks where the bank infrastructure is virtually non-existent. And I want you to talk a little bit about that. There's electronic payment systems in Kenya, there's M-Pesa, et cetera. But in places like Syria and Afghanistan and Yemen and Iraq and Libya, the banking infrastructure really is dilapidated. And why does this make so much sense in places like that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Syria is a really good example. So, you know, Syria previously only about 6% of the population had a bank account.
Yeah.
And the country itself was under really restrictive sanctions for almost 50 years. Yeah, I mean, in differing degrees. And so, the banking infrastructure was very weak. It was very hard to make international payments into the country. Correspondent banking super challenged, et cetera, et cetera. And so when the new government took over from the Assad regime just over a year ago now, and sanctions were lifted. And everybody was optimistic that, okay, so now everything will go back to working like it does in the rest of the world, where you can make a wire transfer and money will, Swift will work and you can just sort of send money across borders. But I think the reality, as we predicted, has turned out to be quite different, because the payments into these jurisdictions are tightly controlled by the correspondent banks. And the correspondent banks have pretty, their risk appetites are limited, yeah? And so even though it is possible for them to, legally now to send money into these jurisdictions or allow sort of payments to come through their systems into these banks, it's very hard to make that system work, particularly for humanitarian organizations, because, there's still a lot of residual risk in their domestic banks in Syria. They had ties to different, previous regime entities in different countries in the region and this sort of thing. And so it's proving very hard for people to use the TradFi, the traditional finance system, to move money in. So if you're an aid organization wanting to get money into Syria, the typical experience would be that you would maybe try the banking system, but after 2 or 3 weeks of your money getting stuck and knocked back and forth and questions being asked, it might land back in your bank account in Europe or North America somewhere. And, your people on the ground are still waiting to do what they do. And then you would probably resort to using an informal money transfer agent. These are sometimes called hawalas or sarafs. And, this is okay. It's sort of one of the oldest systems in the world, but, you might pay 5% and it would still take a few days to get there. So there's high cost and there's still friction in the system. And so, what we demonstrated through some pilots we did, and now we're scaling that, is that it was possible to get money sort of from a US bank account via an on-ramp into the wallets of, farmers in rural Syria. They're cashing out within less than half an hour, and, for like 3%. Yeah. And so the speed and the cost savings and the fact that that's that fully transparent, you can see all those transactions on chain, you can see where everything goes, you can see that how transformative that is in that type of type of a situation, in that type of a market. Now, we would hope that Syria over time will stabilize that the banking sector will get sort of reformed, that regulations will come in place, and Syria will take its place in amongst the nations that have reliable banking systems. But until then, yeah, how do you move money, and how do you do so in a compliant, trustworthy, fast, cheap way? This
Right.
is how.
Yeah. 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 And I think, part of our job and what we've done the last couple of years is try to really educate people about that. And here's a crisis situation. These countries are in distress. There's limited banking infrastructure. This is a solution to that problem, because what you're doing now in terms of cash handouts and all those things really don't work very well. This is far more efficient. The speed with which these transactions take place, as you said, that farmer in Northeast Syria can have something in his or her wallet in 30 minutes or something, which is kind of mind-boggling, actually. So part of our job, at the Algorand Foundation is, and we, because we have some power of convocation, in part because of our investment in partnership with the HesabPay in Afghanistan, we've convened something called the Humanitarian Payments Council, which is designed specifically to bring in large stakeholders like UNHCR, like the United Nations World Food Program, private sector, companies like Visa and MasterCard and WorldPay and Circle, because we see this potential. We have proven this kind of theory of change. And now to educate those folks who can actually bring these kinds of things to scale, which will benefit the people at the end of the line the most, is what the Payments Council is all about. So talk a little bit about, our role as advocates, really advocating based on what's been proven already in the most distressed countries in the world. So talk a little bit about the Humanitarian Payments Council, because I think in terms of adoption at scale, it's an important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I think that's right, Matt. I mean, I think what we've done is sort of we've proven that the technology works. Yeah. And frankly, it's proven to be the almost the easiest piece of the puzzle. The more tricky piece is the sort of the policy and adoption at scale. There's a lot of organizational change, mindset change, to really accept that there are alternative ways of doing of making payments in these types of jurisdictions. And so while we're obviously very focused on Algorand, and we believe Algorand is the best chain to do this sort of thing on, the problem is bigger than Algorand. And so what we really need to do is create a movement to sort of mobilize really powerful stakeholders in sort of that touch different pieces of the problem and have different relationships with policymakers, donors, regulators, etc., to try and change the narrative and drive the case for adoption. Now, I want to make it clear, on-chain payments are not good. Then it's not like a silver bullet that's going to make everything better everywhere.
Right.
What we're really focused on is, there's certain places where payments don't work well, and that's what we're focused on. Other places, maybe there's existing payment rails, the banking system, mobile money, etc. Maybe it works really well anyway, and the benefits of moving on chain would be marginal. What we want to focus on is the places where moving on chain is a game changer.
Yeah.
So what we've done is we've assembled, as part of this sort of coalition of stakeholders, the biggest humanitarian actors in the world. So, for example, we've got the World Food Program, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, a couple of major NGOs. So we've got World Vision and Mercy Corps and a few like that. Then we've got some private sector players, big ones: Visa, MasterCard, Circle, Quantos, WorldPay, big payments networks who really understand how money flows internationally. They already have, teams focused on humanitarian payments, and those teams are also trying to explore how do stablecoins improve their products. Visa is asking how does Visa use stablecoins to improve its humanitarian product offerings. So there's that sort of private sector piece. And then we're working with sort of the donors and the regulators, the sort of the major governments involved in this process. And what we're really trying to do is we're trying to sort of leverage the collective sort of, there's the convening and then there's the access that those different actors have to engage with the donors, the regulators, and the policymakers, and sort of the treasurers of the organizations who have the biggest say on the rails that money moves for their organizations around the world. Bring them together and create a movement. And we've been doing this for a year and a half now with the council.
Almost 2 years now.
And it really feels like we're building momentum. I think Berlin, that meeting we had last fall was, it was fantastic. We demoed the Aid Trust portal. We got some really good collaborations going amongst the group. And so I think, we're building now to a meeting in the summer in Washington, which I think is going to be, is just going to be the next step on that journey. And hopefully collectively we can have sort of outsized influence on the direction that humanitarian payments in these particular jurisdictions work in the future.
Yeah, and you talked about changing the narrative. In January of 25, I think in late January, early February, USAID, which accounted for 30% of the world's aid, 40%, something like that, some significant number, was eliminated overnight. I mean, almost virtually overnight. And part of the reasoning or the pretext was, well, everything's corrupt and none of this money gets to where it's going. And fair enough. Some of that criticism is valid, but it was way overblown. And it was used as a way to kind of eliminate something that meant a lot to a lot of people around the world. Life-saving medicines, particularly, ARVs and others. And it's a shame. And it's a shame that was all lost and not reformed, but completely wiped out. So, I view it as you just said, part of our job is to change the narrative around aid, and changing that narrative means instilling trust in the aid process. And so to that end, in Berlin, we did unveil something called the Aid Trust Portal, which we'd been working on for a couple of years and was finally released in September in Berlin, which was met with, I think, incredible enthusiasm. So talk a little bit about that tool. And for our listeners out there, if you want to check it out, go to aidtrust.io and you'll see what Nigel's about to talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I mean, I think, obviously, as you say, the downfall of USAID was really tragic. And, as one of the most audited institutions in the US government, yes, there were cases of corruption and sort of misuse of funds, which the inspector generals often found. So, I mean, I think it's completely overblown, the narrative around corruption and how the whole thing was rotten. It's just not true. But that being said, to the extent that was an argument about why we shouldn't be sending aid to these places, or we shouldn't be doing this kind of thing, what we're able to do by putting aid on chain is to essentially sort of tackle that argument head on. It's like, if you really mean that you're not giving aid because you can't prove where it goes, and you're not sure it got to the right person, and you're worried that it got skimmed off somewhere, well, look at this system. It you can no longer claim that concern, because if you put your aid on chain, it's just it's all there. It's all there to see. Now, I'm not necessarily convinced that that's entirely genuine, that was the main reason that these cuts were made, but to the extent that it was, this putting aid on chain really tackles it. So to that end, what we've done is, with the Aid Trust portal, is essentially we sort of looked at the block explorers that were out there, and we particularly working with the team at Nodely and Allo and Superior Labs, and we sort of said, look, the block explorers sort of in the tabulated sort of list form, they're great. All the data's there, but it's not intuitive. It's not easy to use, particularly for folks who aren't crypto natives. Like, how do you understand the relationship between wallets? What's going on? What's going where? Can we really bring sort of some powerful data visualization into this sort of world of explorers, and make it much more intuitive and easy to understand for people in the aid sector? So what we did, we built the Aid Trust portal with Superior Labs, and they did an amazing job. It was our vision, but they really did the hard work to bring it to life. But what you can do is, now you can take all the public keys of an aid program. So, you've got 100,000 recipients of aid interacting with, 1,000 merchants, agents, and payments coming out of a few different wallets. You can upload all those as a CSV file with the wallets tagged by category of, beneficiary, agent, merchant, whatever. And you can, it'll generate a beautiful visual for you, an interactive network graph with some, there's some other graphs in there as well, but the main feature is an interactive network graph that you can click on the different wallets, the different nodes, and really get a clear sense of what's going where. And, it's been really powerful so far in the demonstrations we've done for various governments and for various aid organizations, just in that sort of like transparency, trust space. The other thing that we did with the ATP is that we've integrated it with Elliptic's wallet and transaction screening tool, which means that, you can be sure that no wallets involved in any aid program are on any list that has been, flagged as, for illicit activity wallets that have, so if there was to be, that wallet would start sort of glowing red and flashing out of the screen, you'd be able to understand and investigate what's going on. So we're really trying to take existing data, take the power of the blockchain that's always been there in the background. Explorers have always been there in these blockchains, but sort of take it to the next level and say, let us show you what this data means and how it can really help you trust these rails that you can put your aid on.
Yeah. And that's, blockchain offers that traceability, the transparency, the immutability of all data that resides on chain. And this is a way to take that. This is a way to make an argument that, look, if you really believe that some aid is critical, here's a way to make sure that what you're spending is spent in the way that you intended. And so by taking away those arguments, we're making progress, I think. And I think, as I said, part of our job is once we see the results, and we've seen them over and over and over again in Afghanistan and Syria, our job is to evangelize and to bring together these coalitions that will see what we see and go out and spread the word. And I think that is what I see happening in 2026. I see more and more people. Well, our partnership now with the Treasurers Roundtable, for example, more and more people in key positions at these large institutions are seeing this is an answer to what was seemingly an intractable problem, right? We can now trust and verify all this information, this aid flowing from point A to point B, in a way, again, and I keep coming back to agency for the end user, that gives agency to folks who get something of value in their wallet and can spend it as they see fit. So I see that in 2026 as we're going to see a series of exciting breakthroughs, knock on wood, hopefully first in Syria, getting more to scale, and then beyond.
Yeah,
So, all right. Anyway, that was a great conversation. One question I have to ask you. You spent so much time in Afghanistan. You were born in Iran. Why the focus on Afghanistan? You clearly love it and have come back to it again and again in the last 4.5, 5 years, almost your sole focus. So what was it really that is so compelling about that part of the world?
I mean, I guess growing up in that part of the world, it's sort of in my blood, and I learned how to speak, probably not as well as I should, but a couple of the local languages, which means that I can move around relatively easily. But ultimately, it's the people. I love Afghan people. They're amazing, incredibly warm, hospitable. I have many Afghan friends, and with HesabPay, it's really inspiring to work with a fully Afghan team. I'm the only sort of international guy that's part of the team. The rest of the team, Afghan men and women, Afghan female coders, developers are part of the team, and they're doing an incredible job. They've built a product that really works in that environment. They're about to hit 1 million wallets. They just passed 900,000 wallets, million wallets. We're doing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of transactions and millions of transactions a year on the Algorand blockchain. And they've built this thing. It's an Afghan team that's built it. And I find that so inspiring. And at the same time, it's a beautiful country that I love mountains, and that place has some pretty amazing mountains.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, we're proud to support you guys and be a partner. And it's been a thrill for me personally, I think, to watch the growth and to watch, you know, the benefit and the meaning that comes with this has been really kind of a point of pride for me personally, I think for the Algorand Foundation. So thanks, Nigel. Thanks. You were a great first guest on this segment. And we look forward to welcoming other folks again from our ecosystem. Some of our UN partners will have on the show, and we'll talk about how blockchain is used, specifically the Algorand blockchain is used for impact to make the world, sounds corny, it's true, but a more just place, a more equitable place, a place that's fairer for everyone. So thanks, Nigel, and we'll see you all again in a couple of weeks. Adios.
Thanks, Matt. Bye.